By the time the door finally closed, the phones had already gone quiet, the money trails had been mapped, and the rooms watching him had more badges than furniture. This was not a street grab or some loud raid caught on evening news cameras, since this was patient, layered, federal pressure tightening from every direction at once. Somebody had already flipped, conversations had already been recorded, and whole lives were already typed into case files with dates attached. What sat at the center was not just a dealer, but a system that had grown too large to ignore. The real question is how a straight-A honor student reached this point before most people finished college, and why the first lessons did not come from corners, but from his own living room. Rayful Edmond III was born on November 26, 1964, into a Northeast Washington, D.C. household where structure came first and chaos never needed to announce itself. His parents, Rayful Edmond Jr. and Constance Bootsy Perry, both held federal government jobs, with his father working at the government printing office while his mother earned a steady check through the United States Postal Service. That daytime stability existed alongside quiet side hustles that paid faster, taught sharper lessons, and filled gaps regular paychecks never touched. Numbers running, prescription pill sales, and neighborhood connections lived under the same roof as alarm clocks, uniforms, and tax forms, creating a blended routine that never felt illegal inside the house. From early childhood, Rayful learned that money followed organization, and survival depended on knowing who handled what. The center of that household was Constance Perry, whose influence shaped discipline long before ambition entered the picture. She did not frame hustling as rebellion or recklessness, but as resourcefulness in a city that rarely handed opportunities to Black families without strings attached. Years later, prosecutors would play recordings in court where Perry admitted teaching her children how to sell drugs to government workers, treating it like a skill passed down rather than a secret hidden. That mindset removed fear from the process early, replacing it with repetition and expectation. Rayful did not stumble into the mechanics of street economics, since he absorbed them the same way other kids learned chores. The Edmond family operated as a tight unit centered around their grandmother's house at 407 M Street, NE, a place that later doubled as something far more than a family gathering spot. As one of 7 siblings, Rayful grew up surrounded by cousins, aunts, and uncles who moved with shared rules, shared silence, and shared responsibility. Everybody knew their lane, and stepping outside it came with consequences enforced at home, not outside. That environment trained him to value loyalty and discretion long before either became survival tools. Trust mattered more than speed, and mistakes were corrected quietly. By the time Rayful was 9 years old, he already understood the basics of packaging, counting, and lookout work, though nobody framed it as crime inside the family. Bagging pills, watching windows, passing information, and handling customers became routine exposure rather than initiation. The streets did not scare him, since the same language spoken outside echoed inside his house. What stood out was how calmly everything moved, with no yelling, no panic, and no wasted motion. That calm made everything feel manageable, even predictable. Those early routines taught Rayful that money was not random, but tracked through systems that rewarded precision. He watched how numbers were logged, how debts were remembered, and how customers were handled without disrespect, since reputation mattered in small neighborhoods. His father reinforced street discipline, teaching him how to move, when to talk, and when silence saved more than words. These were not flashy lessons, but they stuck because they worked repeatedly. Structure came before desire, and responsibility came before freedom. And what separated this upbringing from typical street narratives was the absence of instability inside the home. Bills got paid, schedules stayed consistent, and expectations never shifted based on mood. Illegal income supplemented stability rather than replacing it, which blurred moral lines early. Rayful did not associate hustling with desperation, but with efficiency and control. That framing mattered later, when scale entered the picture. By the time he reached his teenage years, Rayful already viewed illegal business as inherited knowledge rather than risky experimentation. Discipline, hierarchy, and accountability were already installed, making ambition a secondary layer rather than the foundation. When opportunities appeared later, he treated them like expansions of existing systems instead of sudden chances. The house had already trained him to run something long before he imagined running anything on his own. Rayful Edmond carried that home discipline into Dunbar High School, where teachers described him as respectful, soft-spoken, and consistently prepared. His grades stayed strong enough to place him on the honor roll, and his calm demeanor made him stand out among classmates chasing attention. Basketball added another layer to his profile since he played point guard with a controlled style that mirrored how he approached everything else. Coaches trusted his decision-making, and classmates followed his pace without much resistance. On paper, nothing about his daily routine suggested trouble. While school rewarded patience and compliance, Rayful noticed how money moved differently outside those walls. Northeast DC in the late 70s and early 80s showed him how quickly cash changed hands on corners compared to how slowly progress moved through classrooms. He watched adults leave work exhausted while street money circulated with fewer obstacles. That contrast never turned into resentment, but it planted questions that stayed active in his mind. Efficiency mattered to him, even then. Georgetown University sat nearby, symbolizing legitimacy, status, and access that felt physically close yet structurally distant. Rayful attended games, admired the atmosphere, and understood what that world represented without feeling pulled toward it emotionally. The proximity created awareness rather than longing, showing him how different systems rewarded different kinds of intelligence. Teachers spoke about college paths, while the neighborhood showed him immediate returns tied to organization rather than credentials. Both worlds made sense, though one moved faster. After graduating high school, Rayful briefly enrolled at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, testing the academic route without fully committing to it. That period did not end in conflict or failure, since he simply recognized the pace mismatch early. Classes demanded time, tuition, and patience, while systems he already understood offered quicker feedback loops. The decision to leave school unfolded quietly, framed as adjustment rather than rebellion. He did not see himself quitting something, but reallocating effort. What mattered was that Rayful never abandoned the habits school reinforced. He retained scheduling discipline, note-keeping instincts, and an ability to observe without drawing attention. Those traits transferred easily to street economics, where organization mattered more than bravado. He did not chase violence or reputation, preferring structure, reliability, and delegated responsibility. That approach separated him from peers who relied on intimidation rather than planning. By his late teens, Rayful began cutting powder cocaine and selling small quantities around M Street NE and Hanover Place, using childhood friends and relatives as his initial circle. Early operations stayed tight, relying on familiar faces rather than expansion. He applied classroom logic to street movement, mapping routes, tracking shifts, and adjusting supply based on demand. Nothing moved without reason, and nothing happened without oversight. This phase marked his earliest attempt to turn observation into execution, using intellect rather than aggression as leverage. The streets were not something he reacted to, but something he studied continuously. Each adjustment built confidence, reinforcing the idea that organization could outpace chaos every time. What followed later did not begin with violence, but with planning learned long before the money multiplied. By the time Rayful Edmond reached his late teens, his operations stayed rooted in Northeast DC, moving quietly through blocks he already knew by memory. The geography mattered, since alleyways behind row houses on M Street NE, Hanover Place, and nearby cuts allowed movement without lingering on main roads. Those routes were not improvised, as they were rehearsed repeatedly until timing became muscle memory for everyone involved. Sellers worked short shifts that limited exposure, rotating faces, often enough to avoid patterns forming. Nothing about it felt rushed, which helped keep attention low. Rayful leaned heavily on relatives, childhood friends, and trusted neighbors, keeping the circle familiar rather than ambitious during this phase. Trust outweighed reach, since reliability mattered more than how much product moved on any single day. Kids from the block handled lookout duties, posted near corners or windows, calling out warnings when police cruisers slowed or unfamiliar cars circled. They earned small weekly payments, usually $50 to $100, which felt meaningful to families already struggling. That setup created eyes everywhere without drawing suspicion. Communication stayed simple but layered, relying on phrases that sounded ordinary to outsiders but carried clear meaning internally. Words shifted slightly depending on who was listening, which kept conversations flexible and harder to decode. Walk paths changed frequently, though the destination stayed consistent, reinforcing routine without predictability. Rayful paid close attention to how long each transaction took, adjusting handoffs to minimize idle time. Efficiency reduced mistakes, and fewer mistakes meant fewer problems. What separated this early system from louder crews was how violence stayed in the background rather than the foreground. Disputes over money or territory were handled quietly whenever possible, using pressure, exclusion, or repayment before anything physical came into play. Force existed as an option, but it was not advertised or celebrated. Rayful understood that attention invited competition and enforcement, neither of which benefited growth. Calm operations lasted longer. Money moved steadily but without display, flowing back into supply purchases, small property rentals, and emergency funds. Stash locations shifted between family homes and trusted addresses, reducing reliance on any single spot. Each person involved understood their responsibility clearly, whether counting, packaging, delivering, or watching. Mistakes were corrected internally, often without outsiders ever noticing. That discipline kept the machine stable. As weeks turned into months, consistency created demand that exceeded what small suppliers could sustain. Customers returned regularly, trusting availability and quality, which tightened Rayful's grip on local corners without confrontation. Competitors noticed but struggled to disrupt something that did not announce itself. The system grew too efficient to stay confined to neighborhood scale, even though it still looked modest from the outside. That quiet success set the stage for expansion without noise. Turning point arrived in 1987 during a trip to Las Vegas, where Rayful Edmond attended a heavyweight boxing match surrounded by money and movement. That environment exposed him to people operating at a scale far beyond Northeast DC, including Melvin Butler, a member of the Rollin' 60s Crips from Los Angeles. Butler controlled access to major cocaine suppliers connected to West Coast pipelines tied to Colombian sources. The meeting was not accidental, since Rayful already understood what larger supply could unlock. Opportunity met preparation in that moment. Rather than chasing prestige, Rayful focused on logistics, repetition, and leverage, recognizing that supply stability mattered more than any single connection. Through Butler, he gained access to cocaine arriving from Los Angeles, shipped through commercial airlines using couriers carrying suitcases filled with cash. Flights left Washington loaded with $2 to $3 million, returning with kilograms of cocaine hidden among legitimate luggage. That cycle repeated several times each week, creating predictability that supported expansion. Back in DC, stash houses multiplied, with properties on Morton Place, Orleans Place, and 21st Street joining the grandmother's house on M Street NE. Each location served a defined role, separating storage, packaging, and cash handling to reduce risk concentration. Tony Lewis Sr., a trusted associate from the neighborhood, handled security and wholesale distribution, ensuring order stayed intact as volume increased. Escape routes through backyards and connected row houses remained critical, allowing movement even during heightened surveillance. Rayful structured shifts more tightly as scale increased, assigning 8-hour windows that mirrored legitimate employment schedules. Street sellers earned $400 to $800 weekly, while managers and enforcers received higher compensation tied to responsibility. Communication relied on walkie-talkies, pagers, and coded language refined through trial and error. Phrases like, "My girlfriend on 22nd Street," signaled quantities and prices without raising alarms. That linguistic discipline protected conversations across distance. Territory dominance did not arrive through shootouts or public takeovers, but through supply pressure competitors could not match. Rayful's crew delivered consistent volume, undercut pricing when necessary, and absorbed smaller operations without confrontation. Rivals faded as customers followed reliability, shifting the balance quietly. Law enforcement later estimated that by 1988, Rayful controlled 50 to 60% of Washington, D.C.'s cocaine market. Those figures reflected reach, not bravado. Violence increased around the operation as disputes emerged, though Rayful maintained distance from direct involvement. Enforcers handled protection, armed with automatic weapons when needed, reinforcing boundaries without constant displays. Federal investigators later linked his organization to roughly 30 homicides, most tied to money disagreements or territorial friction. Those incidents underscored how scale amplified consequences, even when leadership avoided direct action. Growth carried weight regardless of intent. By the late 80s, cash flow reached levels that reshaped entire neighborhoods, flooding blocks with drugs and money simultaneously. Couriers moved millions weekly, stash houses stayed active around the clock, and crews operated with practiced calm. The city began to feel saturation as addiction rose and violence spread outward from core areas. What started as a tight local system now pressed against the limits of invisibility. Attention followed volume, and pressure began building where silence once protected everything. As the operation scaled through the late 80s, Rayful Edmond kept his own presence deliberately thin, letting systems speak louder than personality. He rarely stayed on corners, avoided public arguments, and preferred to receive information through layers that insulated him from unnecessary exposure. Communication moved through walkie-talkies, pagers, and carefully shaped phone conversations that sounded ordinary to outsiders while carrying precise internal meaning. Phrases shifted depending on who might be listening, keeping intent flexible while preserving clarity for those trained to hear it. That approach made dominance feel administrative rather than aggressive. Inside the network, routines became so standardized that days blended together without chaos, reinforcing a sense of normal work rather than criminal urgency. Runners checked in at set intervals, stash managers tracked inventory quietly, and couriers followed flight schedules that mirrored legitimate travel patterns. Rayful paid attention to timing more than volume, adjusting movement to avoid creating traffic spikes that attracted notice. Each adjustment reduced friction, keeping the machine smooth even as pressure built outside. That smoothness became habit. Technology served as a shield rather than a weapon, since devices allowed distance without silence. Walkie-talkies handled local coordination, pagers bridged gaps across neighborhoods, and phones carried conversations wrapped in coded phrasing learned through repetition. No single channel held the full picture, which limited damage if one line got compromised. Rayful encouraged that separation, understanding that compartmentalization protected everyone involved. Control came from structure rather than fear. Violence existed within the operation, though it stayed targeted, delegated, and often indirect, handled by enforcers who answered upward without drawing Rayful into scenes. Disputes over missing money, broken rules, or encroachment-triggered responses meant to resolve problems quickly rather than make statements. Automatic weapons appeared when boundaries needed reinforcement, yet displays stayed minimal to avoid escalation. Federal investigators later connected roughly 30 homicides to the organization, illustrating how scale multiplied consequences even when leadership stayed distant. The contrast between intent and outcome grew sharper. What confused outsiders was how calm Rayful remained while devastation followed the network's expansion across neighborhoods. He spoke softly, dressed plainly most days, and moved without the bravado typical of street bosses chasing recognition. That demeanor reassured those inside the system, making operations feel manageable rather than volatile. People showed up, did their jobs, collected pay, and went home, repeating the cycle without drama. Normalcy masked harm. Law enforcement pressure increased steadily as volume rose, even though Rayful avoided public missteps. Surveillance picked up patterns rather than personalities, mapping movement through stash houses, phone records, and financial trails. Informants noticed how rarely his name surfaced in street disputes, which paradoxically made investigators more curious. Success itself became the loudest signal, flagging an organization too efficient to remain invisible. At that point, control could no longer outrun attention. As profits surged into the mid-80s, Rayful Edmond began managing image with the same deliberation he applied to logistics, treating visibility as a tool rather than indulgence. He wore tailored Hugo Boss suits, diamond earrings, and expensive watches selectively, balancing flash with restraint depending on setting. Cars like Jaguars, Porsches, and Range Rovers appeared, though rarely parked long in the same place. Spending followed intention, signaling success without inviting unnecessary confrontation. Presentation stayed calculated. Courtside seats at Georgetown basketball games became part of that curated presence, placing Rayful in spaces associated with legitimacy and status. He wore Hoyas gear, mingled near players, and attended games regularly enough to be noticed without overstepping. That proximity created rumors and curiosity, though evidence never showed players accepting illegal gifts. For Rayful, the arena represented controlled visibility, blending into crowds where money did not automatically raise alarms. The line stayed thin. That balance shifted when legendary Georgetown coach John Thompson intervened, calling Rayful into a private meeting during the late 80s. Thompson confronted him directly, explaining that his association with players threatened their futures and the program's integrity. Rayful listened, respected the boundary, and agreed to step back immediately, understanding the weight Thompson carried in that world. The encounter showed his ability to comply when authority felt legitimate. Retreat preserved access elsewhere. Back in Northeast DC, money filtered into the community through funerals paid, groceries covered, and cash handed to kids on the block. Some neighbors viewed Rayful as generous, a figure who filled gaps left by neglect and underfunding. Others saw the damage spreading through addiction, violence, and instability tied to the same source. Admiration and resentment existed side by side, reshaping neighborhood dynamics quietly. His presence altered expectations. Shopping sprees in luxury apartments surfaced in court records later, including tens of thousands spent on furniture, clothes, and jewelry. Those purchases reflected more than impulse, functioning as markers of success that reinforced loyalty inside the organization. People saw rewards tied to discipline, which strengthened commitment without constant oversight. Yet each visible dollar increased scrutiny from outsiders watching patterns emerge. Image carried cost. By the late 80s, Rayful's double life required constant adjustment, balancing anonymity with recognition in spaces that felt safe. Every appearance required calculation, weighing benefit against exposure, while pressure mounted from law enforcement tracking cash flow. Visibility increased risk even when curated carefully, narrowing margins for error. The mask still held, though cracks were forming where money met attention. By late 1988, pressure started building in ways Rayful Edmond could feel without anyone spelling it out directly. Conversations shortened, couriers hesitated, flights shifted, and people he trusted began sounding careful in ways that felt unfamiliar. Federal agencies did not rush the moment, choosing patience over spectacle while mapping relationships, routines, and financial movement across months. Informants appeared quietly, some motivated by fear, others by leverage, all feeding pieces into a larger picture that no single person could see alone. The operation still ran, though its rhythm tightened. Surveillance wrapped itself around normal life rather than interrupting it, watching phones, tracking travel, and listening for patterns that repeated too cleanly to ignore. Associates flipped without announcements, providing context that turned harmless phrases into evidence once decoded properly. Wiretaps captured conversations that sounded ordinary until paired with timing, quantities, and location data. Rayful noticed conversations ending faster, people avoiding detail, and silence filling spaces where confidence once lived. Awareness replaced comfort gradually. The emotional shift hit hardest when Alta Ray Zanville, his girlfriend, agreed to cooperate after facing her own exposure. Her decision did not arrive with confrontation, but with recorded conversations that reached deeper than any street informant ever could. Those tapes captured not only Rayful's voice, but family dynamics previously shielded by loyalty and routine. Prosecutors later played recordings where Constance "Bootsy" Perry discussed drug sales casually, confirming what investigators suspected for years. That moment collapsed the separation between business and blood. On April 15, 1989, the collapse unfolded as a coordinated sweep rather than chaos. Hundreds of agents moved simultaneously across Northeast DC, hitting stash houses, family homes, and trusted locations mapped carefully over months. Tony Lewis Sr. was arrested at his mother's home on Morton Place, NE, while Rayful was taken into custody later that day at Zanville's apartment. There were no chases or shootouts, only doors opening under warrants and people realizing silence had run out. The system fell inward on itself. Parents, siblings, cousins, and close associates became defendants almost overnight, dragged from familiar kitchens into holding cells without warning. What once functioned as a family-centered structure now appeared on indictments as a criminal enterprise. Children watched adults disappear, neighbors whispered, and houses emptied under seizure notices. The weight landed unevenly, though no one escaped consequence. Rayful's name led the list, but he was far from alone. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the scale of fear and expectation surrounding the case. Jurors remained anonymous, guarded closely, while Rayful traveled daily from Quantico Marine Base by helicopter under heavy U.S. Marshal protection. Bulletproof glass separated defendants from spectators, reinforcing that this was not an ordinary trial. Over 50 witnesses testified, outlining the organization piece by piece, stacking testimony until the picture became unavoidable. The room felt heavy rather than dramatic. When sentencing arrived in December 1989, Judge June Green delivered life without parole for Rayful Edmond on continuing criminal enterprise charges. His mother received 14 years, while other relatives and associates faced long sentences of their own. Punishment spread outward, dismantling more than one man's future. The message landed clearly across the city, even as neighborhoods reeled from the vacuum left behind. Justice did not arrive quietly, nor did it end pain. Federal custody changed Rayful Edmond's surroundings, though it did not erase his instincts or habits immediately. Early placements at facilities like USP Lewisburg introduced him to a different ecosystem built on communication, leverage, and patience. Phone access remained available, and coded speech traveled easily through lines rarely monitored closely enough to catch nuance. Conversations shifted form rather than stopping, relying on familiarity developed over years. Silence proved unnecessary. Inside, Rayful connected with inmates whose reach extended beyond Washington, including Osvaldo and Gustavo Trujillo Blanco, sons of Griselda Blanco, alongside trafficker Freddy Aguilera. Those relationships expanded perspective, exposing him to international networks operating through layered intermediaries. Using conference calls and three-way connections, Rayful helped broker shipments, directing couriers through coded instructions tied to prices and quantities. The reach extended beyond D.C., turning incarceration into relocation rather than shutdown. Investigators later uncovered how calls discussed shipments disguised as personal conversations, referencing girlfriends' addresses or errands tied to specific amounts. Money flowed through Western Union and accounts managed by relatives, sustaining movement even behind bars. More than half of inmates used phones similarly, according to Rayful's later admissions, treating access as opportunity rather than privilege. Control diminished, though influence remained present. The machine adapted. New charges followed as law enforcement intercepted trucks and monitored conversations linked to prison-directed activity. In one incident, an undercover officer observed an Uzi guarding a shipment, reinforcing the seriousness of operations still unfolding. Those cases added decades to Rayful's sentence, sending him through harsher facilities like USP Marion and eventually ADX Florence. Conditions hardened, limiting movement, contact, and comfort severely. Endurance replaced command. Isolation forced reflection without surrender, pushing Rayful toward legal study and strategic thinking rather than impulsive action. He read case law, tracked appeals, and learned how prosecutors built leverage. Conversations shifted toward survival rather than expansion, recognizing that influence now carried diminishing returns. Control narrowed to information, the last asset left untouched. The realization settled quietly, setting the stage for different negotiation entirely. Cooperation arrived as a calculation rather than confession, driven by circumstance more than remorse. Facing the reality of dying behind bars while his mother remained incarcerated reframed Rayful Edmond's priorities sharply. Information became currency, offering leverage in exchange for relief, not only for himself, but for family members still serving time. Loyalty shifted under pressure, rationalized as protection rather than betrayal. The streets viewed it differently. Rayful provided detailed testimony against former associates, traffickers, and cartel-connected figures, supporting cases that led to multiple convictions. His cooperation extended beyond narcotics, including testimony related to prison homicides and organized criminal activity. Prosecutors credited him with aiding dozens of cases, though numbers varied depending on source. Each appearance deepened isolation, marking him as a snitch within inmate culture. Respect evaporated quickly. The most tangible reward arrived with his mother's early release after serving roughly 9 years of her 14-year sentence. That outcome justified cooperation in Rayful's mind, reframing sacrifice as necessity. Sisters and other relatives also benefited from sentence reductions, easing guilt tied to earlier family involvement. Personal reputation suffered irreparably, though family stability improved marginally. Trade-offs replaced absolutes. Years passed as Rayful remained incarcerated, petitioning for sentence reduction supported by prosecutors referencing sustained cooperation. In 2021, a federal judge reduced his life sentence to 20 years, acknowledging decades served and assistance provided. transfer to community confinement in Florida followed in August 2024, placing him closer to release than ever before. Freedom arrived quietly, stripped of triumph. Public reaction split sharply, with some viewing release as overdue, while others saw it as injustice delayed too long. Rayful spoke briefly about mentoring youth, framing survival as lesson rather than victory. That chapter closed abruptly when he died on December 17, 2024, at a Miami halfway house, reportedly from a heart attack. Speculation followed, though official accounts dismissed foul play. His story continues circulating across DC, referenced in lyrics, debates, and memory, existing somewhere between legend and damage. For some, he remains a symbol of ambition warped by circumstance. For others, he represents destruction masked as discipline. What remains is not myth alone, but a warning etched deeply into the city's history.